So I'm going to be talking to you this evening just for about 20 minutes about an issue that comes up a lot in my main area of research, which is medieval philosophy, and in particular philosophy in the Islamic world. I also do stuff on ancient philosophy, late ancient philosophy. And this issue is proofs for the existence of God. And I thought this would be an appropriate topic for this open day for a master's program on philosophy, theology, and religions, because proving the existence of God using philosophical arguments is an obvious point of intersection between philosophy and theology/religion. And I've chosen the somewhat provocative title, Can We Prove that God Exists and Does It Matter? I'm not sure I'll answer either question to your satisfaction, given that I don't have very long, but I'll hopefully say something interesting about both issues. And what I'm going to be doing is looking at a couple of arguments for God's existence, chosen or drawn from the medieval philosophical traditions. My course in this master's is sort of multicultural and looks at all the different traditions of medieval philosophy and beyond that as well. So it's sort of about global philosophy in a sense. So I talk about even non-European, non-Islamic traditions like Africa and India. And one of the things I touch on is a proof for the existence of God that we find in a medieval Muslim philosopher named Ibn Sina or Avicenna. And I talk about that proof more in the actual course. I'll just introduce it to you briefly now. But I also want to talk to you about a proof that's found in a Latin medieval philosopher from Latin Christendom, which I don't get into in the course. And this is Anselm's ontological argument. So these are, I think, probably the two best, most convincing arguments from the medieval traditions for the existence of God. And they fall into two different categories in the kind of classification of proofs for the existence of God more generally. So there's various attempts to classify this. One kind of traditional way of doing it is to say that there are cosmological arguments, which basically argue from the creation of the universe. There are teleological arguments, which argue from the orderliness or goodness of the universe. There are ontological arguments, which basically means arguments that remind people of the ontological argument in Anselm, which I'm about to present on the next slide or the next 2 slides from now. So I'm going to be looking at Avicenna's proof or Ibn Sina's proof, which I think of as a version of the cosmological argument. And then I'm going to be looking at the ontological argument in Anselm. I won't actually go that deeply into the question of whether these arguments work. If you want, we can maybe talk about that in the Q&A. There's something else that I wanted to point out about the arguments, something I think they have in common. So let's first have a look at what Ibn Sina or Avicenna does in his argument for the existence of God. What he's going to do is prove the existence of God on the basis that not everything can be contingent. Rather, there must be some necessary being, and this necessary being will be God. So before I can launch into an explanation of the proof, I need to tell you what he means by contingent and necessary. Maybe we can start with what's necessary, because that's kind of easier to understand. So something is necessary if it couldn't fail to be the case, right? So like 1 + 1 = 2, that's a necessary truth. And when I say that that's necessarily true, what I mean is that there are no circumstances under which it could fail to be true, right? It must be true. And importantly, from Ibn Sina's point of view, it's sort of intrinsic to it that it must be true. Like you don't need to know anything else to see why it's true. Just in its own terms, it can't fail to be true. So the question of whether there's a necessary being, or as he would say, a necessary existence, is really the question of whether there's anything that exists in that way. So is there something that exists in such a way that it could not fail to exist? If so, that would be a necessary being or a necessary existent. He calls it in Arabic wajib al-wujud, which literally means the necessary of existence. So that's a necessary existent. Briefly, we could think about the idea of an impossible existent. So an impossible existent would be something that just by its own nature could not exist, like say a round square. So a round square can't exist because it would have to be both round and square. And those are incompatible, right? What's in between the necessary and the impossible is the possible, or I think it might be more helpful to say contingent, because of course necessary things are in a sense possible too, right? So what I mean by contingent is something that's neither necessary nor impossible. What does that mean? Well, something will be a contingent existence if it could exist, but also could not exist. Just as something could be contingently true if it might be true, but it doesn't have to be true, right? So for example, I'm sitting down right now is a contingent truth. When we say that it's a contingent truth, we mean that it is true, but it didn't have to be true. Similarly, a contingently existing thing is something that does exist, but doesn't have to exist, right? So I would be an example, right? So I exist happily, but I don't have to exist. At least there's nothing intrinsic to me that guarantees my own existence. I will prove this to you. I'm only years old. I'm actually about to turn 50 this summer. So I'm about to turn 50. So that means that 51 years ago, I didn't exist, right? And like even being very optimistic, 100 years from now, I won't exist anymore either, right? Because I'll be dead. So obviously I don't have to exist, right? I used to not exist, and in the future I won't exist again. So I'm a contingent existent. So here's now what Avicenna is going to do. He's going to say, well, just using the fact that some things exist contingently, I'll prove to you that something needs to exist necessarily. So it can't be, in other words, that everything that exists contingently. That's a kind of technical way of putting it, but I can put it less technically by just saying, well, Messina is going to show us that not everything that exists is such that it could have failed to exist. There's going to be at least one thing, in fact, only one thing that has to exist just by its very nature. And of course, that will be God. And here's how he does it. He says, well, take not just me and you and your computer and Australia and Arsenal Football Club. We were just talking about that before we started. Take not only just a few contingent things, but take all of the contingent things. So everything around you, everything in the universe, really, is going to be something that could fail to exist. Take that all together as a kind of set. This will be the aggregate of contingently existing things. And now ask yourself, well, is that aggregate contingent or necessary? So basically what we're asking here is the whole universe contingent or necessary? In other words, is the whole universe such that it could fail to exist? And presumably your answer will be yes, right? So if everything in the universe is contingently existing, then the universe as a whole would be contingently existing. Avicenna actually pauses here and says, well, if you think the universe exists necessarily, then I already proved my case, right? Because what I'm trying to prove is that something exists necessarily. And you just admitted that something exists necessarily, namely the universe. But he's assuming that you'll agree with him that the universe is contingent. Now he makes another move and he says, well, if contingent things are things that might exist or might not exist by their very nature, then it must be that they need some reason or cause to bring them into existence, right? So just like I'm contingent, so I don't have to exist, that means we need to find some explanation for why I do exist. And the explanation would be my parents, let's say, giving birth to me. So in general, we can say that whatever is contingent needs a cause. If the whole universe is contingent, it needs a cause. And we already took everything that's contingent in this aggregate of contingent things. We called it the universe, right? So this cause will be outside the set of contingent things. It's obviously not impossible because it wouldn't be able to cause anything to exist if it were impossible. So it must be necessary. Ta-da, there's a necessary existent. So that's kind of his proof. I actually simplified it a bit at numerous steps, but that's the basic idea. If I sort of take a step back from it, because that was all still a little bit technical, I could put it even more simply by saying that in a way, Avicenna's proof here is just to get you to ask yourself, well, is there some reason why everything exists? And the reason why everything exists can't just be the things themselves, because they could easily not have existed. There must be something sort of above and beyond them that makes them exist. So this proof, in rather exacting philosophical technical fashion, I think captures an intuition that a lot of theists have, namely that God is the ultimate explanation for why everything is, for why everything has being. And this will be a necessary being. So that's Zeno's proof. Another proof, famous proof, is found in an earlier philosopher, also medieval, named Anselm. He lived in France and England. So he lives very far away from Ibn Sina, who lived in Central Asia. And his proof, which is usually called the ontological argument, goes like this. We have a kind of concept of God, he says, which is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So notice he's not saying it's the best thing we can think of or we can conceive of. He's saying this is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So there's nothing beyond this thing, okay? I sort of summarized this phrase, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, as X on the handout, or on the PowerPoint rather, so that I didn't have to keep saying it over and over. So far he hasn't really started arguing for anything, right? He's just kind of given you a concept. So here's an idea, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, X. And the proof, of course, is going to be to show that something like that exists, okay? And of course, that will be God. So here's how the proof works. He says, well, suppose that it didn't exist. Suppose there were no X. There were nothing than which nothing greater can be conceived. Or to put it another way, that than which nothing greater can be conceived does not exist. Well, if that were true, then X would not be X, right? That than which nothing greater can be conceived would not be that than which nothing greater can be conceived, because if it didn't exist, it would be really easy to think of something better than it, like an ice cream sundae, right? Like I'd much rather have an ice cream sundae than a non-existent X. So that's a contradiction. And the contradiction follows immediately from the supposition that this thing does not exist. Therefore, it does exist. Again, ta-da. And in fact, this really does feel, I think a lot of people feel like this is some kind of trick, right? Because it's so fast, it's so easy. It can't be that easy to prove that God exists, right? And there are various reactions to this through the history of philosophy. Kant didn't like it, and Kant explained what he didn't like about it, and so on. So again, I don't really want to get into like whether this works or not. There's actually a good story about Bertrand Russell walking through Cambridge one day and suddenly realizing in a flash that the ontological argument works, and becoming a theist very briefly, and then being like, no, never mind, it doesn't work, and going back to being an atheist. So, you can see whether you think that quick argument works or not. Something that's interesting is that he then goes on to say that than which nothing greater can be conceived must not only exist, but must necessarily exist, because it's better to necessarily exist than not to necessarily exist. So since it's that than which nothing greater can be conceived, if I can conceive of this thing as necessarily existing, that would be better, right? So it must have any kind of perfection. Anything that makes it better must belong to it, including necessary existence. So actually both Avicenna and Anselm show that God exists necessarily, not just that God exists. Okay, now here I come to my actual point, having given you these two arguments, which is that they have something in common. And what they have in common is that, in a way, they don't prove the existence of God. Of course, they prove the existence of something that is to be identified with God. But at first blush, all that we have here is Avicenna proving there is a necessary existence. And we have Anselm proving there is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But suppose I come along to Anselm and I say, well, actually, I like ice cream sundaes so much that I cannot conceive of anything greater than an ice cream sundae. He would disagree that that was a good way of thinking, but it would show that I'm agreeing with him that there is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, but I haven't admitted that God exists, right? I just say, oh yeah, there are ice cream sundaes, all right. So I agree with you that X exists, but I don't agree with you that God exists. Similarly, suppose that I'm a Platonist about numbers, and I say to Avicenna, well, I think that the number 4 exists necessarily. I don't think God exists, but I do think there are necessary existence, like the number 4. So what that shows you is that both of these proofs actually function by creating a kind of placeholder for God, On the one hand, the necessary existent. On the other hand, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And they're not done, right? What they need to do next is show us that these placeholders can sort of be filled out with all of the attributes and features that we associate with God, like omnipotence, benevolence, immateriality, and so on. And in fact, this is exactly what they both do. So what they both do is they give us this proof, and then they say, okay, now that we've proven that this thing exists, let's talk about what it's like. So for example, Avicenna proves that the necessary existent cannot be a body because it can't have parts, because he says that necessary being could never have parts, because if it had parts, it would depend for its existence on its own parts. And a necessary existent can't depend on anything, right? Because it can't have a cause. Again, you might wonder whether that's a great argument, but that's not the point. The point is that he wants to make a further argumentative move to get you from the necessary existent to the idea of something that's immaterial, where he needs to show you that the necessary existent would be immaterial. Similarly, Anselm says God must be immaterial. Why? Well, because at least his intuition is better to not have a body than have a body. So that than which nothing greater can be conceived must be immaterial, must not have a body. Otherwise, I could conceive of something greater, right? So it's the same thing. It's in both cases an attempt to kind of churn out all of the traditional divine attributes from these starting notions of necessary existence and that in which nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, so that's what I had to say about whether God can be shown to exist. Basically, the answer is maybe. And if you do it, then you probably need to do more than just show that God exists. You need to show that something exists and then show that it's God in sort of two steps. At least that's how Avicenna and Anselm did it. But now let's come to a different question, which I think is really a question people don't think about enough with respect to medieval philosophy, because we really just take it for granted that medieval philosophers, they love proving the existence of God, right? It's like a standard thing they always do. But why, right? Like, have Avicenna or Anselm ever met anybody who doesn't believe in God? No, of course not. Have they ever met anyone who's ever met anyone who doesn't believe in the existence of God? No. Have they ever heard of anybody who doesn't believe in the existence of God? No. There are no atheists in medieval France. There are no atheists in Central Asia in the time of Ibn Sina. Okay, I mean, maybe there were, like maybe there was some atheist somewhere lurking in the bushes, in theory. But that's not a reason to write pages and pages of proving the existence of God, right? Who are you trying to convince here, right? So why write all these arguments? And these are brilliant arguments, right? They put a lot of thought into this. So why bother, right? That's my question. I mean, in a way, my point here is that there's a lack of opposition. And in general, it's strange to put a lot of effort into arguing for something where there's no opponent who denies it. And it's certainly, you might think, strange to put so much central emphasis on this, right? To really make it the core of their metaphysical treatment of God. I mean, in the work of Anselm that we're talking about literally begins with the ontological argument. So I think there are several reasons. And one has a lot to do with themes that I talk about in my course for the masters, because my course is primarily about how reason interacts with revelation and religious belief. And I think that this tendency to want to prove the existence of God speaks directly to that question. Because you might think, well, okay, everyone I know believes in God. I believe in God. I mean, if I'm a medieval, I actually don't believe in God, but if I'm a medieval theologian or philosopher, I obviously believe in God, right? So why do I believe in God? Well, I might believe in God because I'm a Muslim or because I'm a Christian, right? But it would be quite nice if I could also say that my belief in God were rational. And it would be nice for a couple of reasons. First of all, if I'm a philosopher, I probably want to be able to say that reason gives me some kind of access to God, right? So you might be a mystic and think, well, the only way you can really know about God would be to have some kind of direct experience of him, let's say. But if I'm a rationalist philosopher, I probably don't want to say that. I probably want to say that I can use reason to establish that God exists, among other things about God, right? That doesn't, of course, mean that I can use reason to grasp God fully. In fact, here's a nice thought. Think about Anselm's proof again and ask yourself, well, should Anselm think that God can be grasped fully by reason or not? Well, he would probably have to say, well, it's better to transcend human reason than not. So actually, that than which nothing greater can be conceived should actually transcend human reason and the grasp of human reason. So actually, his proof, in a way, at least potentially, shows that he cannot grasp God fully, but he can grasp God partially. And he just showed you how, right? He proved that God exists. He proves that God is necessary. He proves that God doesn't have a body, et cetera, using the same trick over and over, right? That in which nothing greater can be conceived has to have all these properties. I think Avicenna was probably more ready than Anselm would have been to say that God is grasped fully by reason. But the point is that philosophers in general in these cultures, although they understand that they don't really need to show that God exists, in the sense that there's no opponent who denies it, they really want to show that God exists because it really is telling you something about reason rather than telling you something about God, right? It's more an argument in favor of reason than it is an argument in favor of God, in a way, right? And if you push a little further and ask, well, like, why is it better to be able to prove God rationally than just believe it? The answer might be that just in general, it's better to believe things for good reasons or on the basis of good arguments or evidence than it is to believe things because someone told you to believe it, right? So imagine that I come along to Avicenna and I say, well, the reason I believe in God is because my parents raised me to believe in God. So Avicenna might say, well, it's good that you believe in God, but that's a terrible reason for believing in God. You should believe in God because you have good grounds for doing so, and you don't, right? You just believe it because you were raised that way. In the Islamic world, there was actually a word in Arabic for uncritically believing in things because someone else told you to believe in them, and this was taqlid. So taqlid is when you are basically following what other people say without reflecting on it yourself. And this was thought to be a really bad thing, actually. So it's an insult you can throw at other people, especially at intellectuals. Like, for example, critics of the philosophers sometimes said that they were just uncritically following Aristotle's philosophy all the time. So they actually used the word taqlid as an accusation against them, right? Meanwhile, the philosophers said that the theologians were engaging in taqlid. So everyone's accusing everyone else of taqlid. Everyone's saying, well, you just follow authority. You don't think for yourself. This is, of course, exactly what we usually don't think medieval philosophers want to do. So medieval philosophers have a reputation for being very bound by authority and always just kind of following in the established lines of what they were taught, right? And they're not allowed to challenge authority and so on. Actually, at least in the Islamic world, that's not true at all. In the Islamic world, the kind of defining feature of being in the so-called ulama, the scholarly class, is that you don't engage in uncritical belief. You don't engage in taqlid. So by showing that you can prove the existence of God, in this case, you say, well, I do believe in God just like the rest of y'all, but you probably just believe it because you were raised to. I believe it for a good reason, and you should believe it for the same reason I do, namely, here's my proof, right? So that's another reason. And finally, and coming back to the observation I made about what those two proofs have in common, remember I said that both of them, what they really do is sort of create a placeholder onto which they can then add divine attributes. And I think actually that's also true of a lot of proofs for God's existence in the medieval period. It's also true of Aquinas's so-called 5 ways in the Summa Theologiae. So in a sense, what you're doing is proving that God exists, and I wouldn't deny that, because I think that was important for them for the reasons I just said. But also, you're kind of making a first step in your philosophical theology, right? So ultimately, what I want to do is give you a philosophical account of God. So I start by showing that God exists, but the way that I show that God exists is going to give me a kind of platform for showing other things about God, as if, for example, that he doesn't have a body, that he's powerful, that he's good, whatever. And what's really powerful about the way that Avicenna and Anselm do it is that they can use the same rationale for God's existence that they use for everything else about God, right? So Avicenna generates all the divine attributes out of the notion of necessity. Anselm generates all the divine attributes out of the notion of that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So that gives them a very unified, tightly structured way of talking about God rationally or philosophically, which they clearly both liked a lot. So I think what that goes to show, this last slide, that is that proofs of God's existence are proofs of God's existence, but it's not only about proving God's existence, and it's maybe not even mostly about proving God's existence, because that's kind of uncontroversial. It's the way you do it that matters. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. That was, I think, about 20 minutes, so I will stop there, and maybe people have some questions.